Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the KDI School World Bank monthly webinar series. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I'll be your MC today. Before we get started, please note that today's webinar will be recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. This webinar is a joint program with the World Bank. In each session, experts from the bank share their latest findings with the KDI School community. We hope you gain exclusive insights into the cutting-edge research and also take a moment to reflect on how it can be applied. If you have any questions or comments, please wait for the Q&A session or leave your messages in the chat. Today's webinar topic is hooked on subsidies, rising fiscal costs, and the imperative for reform. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished speakers, Dr. Fernando Andres Blanco Cossio, lead economist, and Mr. Eric Anthony Lacey, economist both from the Fiscal Policy Unit at the World Bank. First, Dr. Fernando Blanco is a lead economist in the Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit at the World Bank. A Bolivian national, Dr. Blanco joined the bank in 2002 and has since worked across Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and the MENA regions. He specializes in macroeconomics and fiscal policy and has led major analytical work and policy-based lending operations totaling over $2 billion. Before joining the World Bank, he worked at Brazil's Institute of Applied Economic Research and taught economics at IBM-EC and the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, where he also earned his PhD in economics. And Mr. Eric Lacey is an economist with the Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit in the Economic Policy Global Practice at the World Bank. Eric primarily supports public finance reviews, both through data support and as an author. Eric also coordinates scorecard reporting, the results monitoring on domestic revenue mobilizations, and contributed to the forthcoming Prosperity flagship on subsidies. Before joining the World Bank 6 years ago, Eric spent 2 years as an American Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso and 2 years as an English teacher in Japan with the JET program. Eric, a United States national, has a master's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Washington. Everyone, please warmly welcome Dr. Fernando Blanco and Mr. Eric Lacey.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Fernando Blanco. As I was already presented, I am together with my colleague Eric, and we will present the findings of our forthcoming report on subsidies that we have been working since the last year. I will share my screen, and hopefully we will be able to see. Can you see my, okay, perfect. Well, as I mentioned before, what we will show in this presentation are the main findings of our report that hopefully will be released in December of this year. The idea of the report was to assess subsidies around the world and see first, try to measure the fiscal cost of subsidies. That is the part that Eric will present. And also try to assess how subsidy policies are designed, evaluated, etc. So this is what we will focus on this session. So basically what we will present is an introduction, a motivation of why subsidies are becoming very, very important in fiscal policy, and also not only on fiscal policy, but in general on government policies, trying to improve investment, innovation, etc. We will take a look to that. And then Eric will present our estimations of the fiscal cost of subsidies. Then I will present how subsidies should be designed, implemented, or reformed, a framework, an analytical framework for countries to try to improve the design of their subsidies, also to assess the impact that these subsidies have. So it's a framework that we propose to be applied on different instruments that are basically different type of subsidies. Then we have a methodology of cost-benefit analysis of subsidies that we also propose in this report. And finally, we will discuss some political economy aspect of subsidy reform. While in many cases everybody knows that subsidies are inefficient, that they are not that they don't generate income distribution, etc. Subsidies persist because there are political economy aspects that prevents to reform the subsidies. So we have an entire chapter dedicated to define strategies to overcome political economy obstacles to subsidy reform. Our report also has the second part of our report has sectoral study cases, on different sectors, from incentive to investments through reductions of CAT rates, also innovation subsidies that foster innovation, subsidies that foster green technologies, different types of subsidies in agriculture, in water, in different sectors. And we will this part, as is very dense, we will concentrate on in this presentation only on the first part. But if there is interest to analyze sectoral subsidies, we are happy to have other session, and it's just to let us know we can do, and also call our specialists that work in the sectoral chapters. With that outline, I will start the presentation with the introduction. Basically, subsidies can be, I would say, there are subsidies can be good or bad. Basically, what we call here is that if subsidies work well, basically they can improve economic performance, accelerate growth, create jobs, because they can address market failures, they can improve investment, productivity, they can promote innovation. Also, subsidies, when they are well designed, they can improve income, they support income of vulnerable groups. Also, they can provide benefits in kind, and they can also ensure the access to essential goods, subsidies in the water sector, in electricity, etc. The idea is to reduce prices and improve the access of in principle, of the poor population to these essential goods and services. But also subsidies can be dangerous, and at their worst, they can the first thing that they are fiscally very costly. And in several cases, as Eric will show, they contribute to fiscal unsustainability. Also, in many cases, while the objective is clear and is good, they are ineffective in achieving these objectives because design problems or other distortions that they promote, they don't meet the objectives that justify the establishment. Also, they can be very inefficient in the terms that they can create distortions in the allocation of resources, and also in consumption and investment decisions. In several cases, while the idea is to reduce poverty and improve the access to basic goods to the poor, they can be normally very unfair. Normally, what happens is, in some cases, you pick some sectors or some type of firms, and the other firms that they don't receive the benefit are negatively affected. Or if you create a subsidy, for example, to reduce energy prices, the welfare household are the most, they benefit the most of this type of support, and the poor, they receive just part of the benefit. And finally, they can also promote environmental problems. No? If all fossil fuel subsidies, for example, they harm the environment, and they create social cost. So the idea is to assess what are the conditions in which subsidies can be helpful, and also why subsidies are in general ineffective. And for that, what we found is that first, there is not clarity on the definition of subsidies. There are several policy instruments that are considered subsidies, or in other cases not. So there is a problem of definition. Most importantly, only part of the subsidies are accounting in the fiscal accounts, or are registered in the fiscal account. Several subsidies, for example, tariffs that are non-cost reflective. In general, this type of tariffs that are subsidized tariffs, they are not included in the fiscal accounting as expenditure. So they are normally the amount of subsidies is underestimated. As I mentioned, the fiscal costs are several subsidies are not included in the fiscal accounts. The subsidized credit, for example, is a case in which governments, they don't register the amount of subsidized credit that provide to the private sector. And more importantly, they don't have cost benefit analysis to see, okay, this subsidy has this objective, this is the cost, and we don't measure the benefit. And on that, this is why they subsist, no? Because there are no evidence that these subsidies can be harmful, etc. The aim of the report is that I would say we have three aims. No? One is that subsidies need to achieve the good value for money. That is the main reason. But also the idea to reduce fiscal pressures is a second objective of reforming the subsidies. You can do better, is the first objective. Also, you can save if you use if you reduce or eliminate the subsidies that are ineffective, and this can be free up resources for other government programs, etc. So the objective of the report was to analyze what are the criteria in which you can consider that this subsidy is inefficient or ineffective, and the money can be reallocated to other uses, or the own subsidy can be repurposed or reformed for a better result. So we depart in our report, we depart with a very clear definition of subsidy, because that, as I mentioned before, there is no clarity on the definition. Different agencies consider different type of instruments, and they don't consider that they are subsidies. But for us, subsidies are the first characteristic is that they are fiscal policy instruments, and the second characteristic is that they consist in unrequited transfers from the government to economic sectors, to economic agents, saying that when the government transfers the money, the government doesn't create an obligation for the beneficiary to return the resource. So it's unrequited transfer. There is no the need to return the transfers from the agents to the government. So how these transfers are transmitted? Basically, there are three ways in which these transfers are allocated to the private sector. The first is revenue foregone. In revenue foregone, we understand when the government, for example, has a corporate income tax rate of 20%, but they decided that for specific investment or in specific sectors, the rate reduced to 10%. So this is a revenue that the government is not receiving. This is why we call revenue foregone. Or other cases when you have VAT, different rates for VAT in the value-added tax, or you subsidize, or you have zero rates for basic goods. This is other revenue foregone that the government is not receiving, and this is why we consider revenue foregone. A third type of revenue foregone is what I already mentioned: subsidized tariffs. When if the cost of providing water, for example, is subsidized, the government, they don't receive from the consumers the price or the cost of the generation of water. So again, it's a type of revenue foregone subsidy. The subsidies that are most registered, more known, are the expenditure subsidies, that are direct transfers to firms or to consumers. These normally they are more registered in subsidies. But there is a part that is also difficult to account, and are capitalizations, equity injections, and warranties. These operations they are below the line, are difficult to identify and to measure. In our definition, we exclude general fiscal policies. For example, in several, the OECD and the European Union consider, for example, tariffs as a type of subsidy, or regulations. In this case, as we don't consider that these have fiscal implications, we exclude this type of government policies. For us, for example, a trade tariff is not a subsidy. In the case of the OECD or European Union, they consider that this is a transfer. So I will pass now the word to Eric to present the second part, our estimation of the fiscal cost of subsidies.
Thank you very much, Fernando. So I have a lot of material to cover and not much time. So what I'm going to do is move through it relatively quickly, but I will be sure to point out the high-level messages that I suggest you take away from this presentation. First high-level message, the cost of subsidies is not well understood. For one thing, you can see in this concentric circles diagram, we have on the outside all of the types of fiscal subsidies that we can conceive of. And there are many that are just absolutely not measured at all, or if they are measured, they're measured differently across countries and hard to compare, or they're measured differently and not reported. So there are all kinds of reasons why we may not have access to this information. Then as you go closer to the center, you get types of subsidies that are still difficult to account for, but perhaps a little easier, or there are more data available. And then on the inside, you get areas where we have observations for select countries, but not for enough to really get a global picture. In the innermost circle, you're going to see the figures that I'm actually going to present in the rest of this section. And those are direct transfers to firms, which are unrequited, that meet our definition of a fiscal subsidy, direct transfers to households that are unrequited, like social assistance, and revenue foregone from tax expenditures. We have enough data on these to be able to draw a picture. But keep in mind, everything I'm going to show you from here on out is just what we know out of a wider set that we don't know. Next slide, please. Lesson 2, subsidies cost a lot. Here we see the fiscal cost of subsidies reaches about 6.7% of GDP, and a much larger share of revenue and expenditure. This takes those two types of transfers to firms and households, unrequited, and adds tax expenditures, and by country takes a median across countries. So we get a nice view of what is a typical cost for an emerging market developing economy. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we break them apart by transfers to firms, households, and tax expenditures. And there's two things to notice here. One, tax expenditures cost a lot more. In most developing countries, a lot of that revenue foregone is not going to be explicitly a budget item line. It's going to be something that it could be provisions hidden in different parts, either in the tax code or not. And then for countries that cost them, we see that the cost comes out to about double or more than double than what countries spend on actual transfers. But this is still a fiscal cost. It's revenue you didn't collect. The other lesson here is that if you compare the dark blue bar, which is pre-pandemic, and the light blue bar, which is the most recent data that we have for enough countries to generalize, you see that direct transfers went up during the pandemic and they haven't come down at least all the way. So we are in a period of higher subsidies. Next slide, please. This one shows 2 points in time. So on the left-hand side, you see average overall balances among developing countries in 2013. And on the far right-hand side in the dark blue bar, you see average overall balances in 2023. And then what you see in each section in the middle is the delta that affects the overall balance attributable to just that type of revenue or expenditure. So for instance, tax revenues increased on average and contributed to over 1% of GDP increases in the overall balance. But that's if we held everything else constant. Of course, we didn't. Everything else moved too. So that other revenues on average went up in developing countries. Many types of expenditure also increased, which means they're pointed down because what's shown on the graph is their contribution to the overall balance. And we see that a very large category here is transfers to households. Interest expense naturally went up as all expense went up. But you see that aside from interest expense and things that affect the primary balance, direct transfers to households were the largest item. Next slide, please. This chart takes all the cases in which direct transfers increase, so whether they were to firms or households, and simply asks the question, when direct transfers increase, look at the fiscal identity, what else moves? Because there's really three broad things that can happen. Either, one, you increase revenue and it offsets it. Many things can move in tandem, of course, but primarily maybe revenue increases, and that explains where the funds came from. Two, you could reduce expenditure on something else. Or three, you could borrow to plug the gap. And so in the bottom chart here, you see kind of how often each happens. Of course, it's always a mix, but predominantly we have increasing net borrowing being the most likely case. The top bar splits those apart into different cases. And you see that among revenue, usually tax revenue explains the increase, but you have other types of revenue and grants, both of which tend to be extremely volatile and difficult to rely on. You see an expenditure when types of expenditure are cut simultaneous with an increase in subsidy expenditure, investment is cut quite often, at least some amount. And finally, under debt, when you increase net borrowing, usually countries are not going from a very nice surplus to slightly less of a surplus. Usually they're going from a deficit to a deeper deficit. Next slide, please. In this one, we ask the question, what is the effect of subsidies on output stabilization? As the audience knows, an important role of fiscal policy is managing fluctuations in output relative to where output is really supposed to be. So when the economy is overheating, you don't want to pump lots of spending to boost aggregate demand. The economy doesn't need it. And when there's slack in the economy, because of a recession, high unemployment, that's the time to spend more. And so you can calculate cyclicality coefficients, which basically take many years of spending, revenue, movements in the primary balance, and movements in cyclical GDP. So when is GDP above the sort of target level? When is the economy overheating and not? And you can take coefficients of these values and sort of capture in one number how pro or counter-cyclical the economy is, and how much of that is attributable to different types of expenditure. And so what we find is that tax expenditures, represented by the dots in the left-hand graph, are generally quite pro-cyclical. They're designed in a way that the revenue foregone tends to increase during times where the economy is already overheating. So you're contributing to more money in the pockets of people and more spending. Likewise is not as present when there's slack in the economy. And counter-cyclical, there's a maybe not really even any counter-cyclical tax expenditures on average here, because even that one that's negative there is close to zero. Among subsidies to firms, figures are also relatively close to zero, but you see kind of a bit of a standout in MENA, that the coefficient we calculate shows that spending on subsidies to firms is higher when the economy is overheating in MENA, as it should really probably not be. And then among SSA and South Asia, we see that there is some counter-cyclical spending where it's happening when we expect it to. The right-hand chart focuses on fossil fuel subsidies, and the distribution goes from counter-cyclical to the left to pro-cyclical to the right. And you see there's a big chunk of countries distributed more around pro-cyclical with their fossil fuel subsidies. Next slide, please. This simply reorganizes everything again, but compares to other types of expenditure. And you see that tax expenditures are among the most pro-cyclical type of provision here. And direct transfers to households and firms are actually supposed to be quite counter-cyclical. Now, this sample includes high-income countries, which tend to have more systems in place that help them make their spending counter-cyclical. So it kind of gives you a sense of, with all countries at once, that subsidies are inherently, direct transfers are inherently better tools for managing fluctuations in output. That you can use them in a way that can support the poor, for example, in times of slack in the economy. But from the previous slide, we saw that this is not done in most EMDEs. Next slide, please. Then we look at the question, just how much do we stand to save if we rationalize subsidies, if we brought them down? So this thought experiment just says, let's take subsidies on transfers to firms and tax expenditures, and let's just say that in any country where they're above the median level, let's reduce them to the median level and find out how much we would save if we did that. And so among countries where there is savings to be had, you see that in general, it's turning primary balances from negative numbers into positive numbers. So quite a significant amount of savings on average among countries that could benefit from this. So this is really the start of where we're going to show in this presentation that really it's a non-trivial amount of fiscal savings you could achieve by reforming subsidies. So the next question we're going to ask is, do countries employ this very much? Next slide, please. The chart on the left first takes a bunch of cases of fiscal consolidation, which in our definition is just a case where the primary balance is improving over 2 years for at least 2 years in a row. And in this, we take a purely data-driven inventory of all the episodes in the history of the world that we have data for where a country was consolidating fiscally, whether because they're cutting expenditure or increasing revenues. Whatever it is, we just know they're doing it at this moment. And so we ask the simple question, are they cutting subsidies at the same time? And so all of the episodes sort of on the left-hand side that are pointing downwards show a delta subsidy expenditure that is negative during consolidation. That means that subsidy changes in subsidy policy contributed to consolidation. And all the ones on the right are the ones where subsidies increased in the middle of a country attempting to get its budget in order. We showed that it's a little bit tilted towards contributing to consolidation, but not across the board. In fact, on average, it's pretty close to a net zero. So then we ask the question, but what if they did? What if they did? Well, let's just look at the ones on the left-hand side. How do they do? And so we see that despite the fact that expenditure on subsidies, in this case, direct transfers, being about 12.5% of total expenditure, that when they're cut, they play more than half of that role in the cut in expenditure. So in this way, we see that although it is not the norm to necessarily cut subsidies when countries are seeking to rationalize and improve their fiscal balances, when they do, it looks as though they can do so substantially. Next slide, please. Finally, we ask a simple question. How often are these movements really happening? Are these flexible economic categories that can be adjusted to be consolidated, or is it unrealistic to expect so? So we take a measure of rigidity, where rigidity is basically how much can a type of an economic classification of expenditure move when looked at over time. So is it something that policymakers can adjust within reason without making big sacrifices? And so a simple measure of this is effectively how much does it change over time? How much is it fluctuating? And so we look at the standard deviation divided by the mean to sort of standardize and compare different types of expenditure. And we see that, perhaps unsurprising, the wage bill spending on goods and services tends to be extremely rigid across countries. This is simply a median of the country level result among EMDEs. And we find that types of subsidies, direct transfers, tend to be much more flexible. And so taken with the experiences of countries that cut them substantially when they do, given that these fluctuate a lot more than people typically think, and given the scope of savings you can get with this, and given the record of subsidies in contributing to a deterioration in primary balances, we consider this robust evidence that subsidies, when it's decided that they're the right subsidies to cut, can contribute to significant improvements in fiscal sustainability. Thank you very much.
Yes. Now, what we will show now is a toolkit of how to assess subsidies. Eric's main findings were that first, subsidies are underestimated, basically, the accounting is not comprehensive on subsidies. Second, that subsidies contributed to the deterioration of fiscal balances and debt in many countries. The third thing is that subsidies can contribute a lot on fiscal adjustment, on fiscal consolidation episodes, because but now are currently underused. And the last thing is that there is hope, no? That given that it's not a very rigid expenditure, can be adjusted. The message is to say, okay, subsidies can be used for fiscal adjustment. Here we say, okay, but what type of subsidies needs to be reduced or repurposed or eliminated? And this second part of our report provides an analytical tool or framework to evaluate the effectiveness of subsidies, and is what we developed and offer for countries to assess the subsidies. Basically, our toolkit consists in 6 main blocks. The first is that what we call rational and appropriateness, meaning that if the first question that we need to ask when you create a new subsidy or when you want to eliminate the subsidy is what was the rationale for which the subsidy was created. The second question is, okay, if the subsidy was created to achieve a certain objective, what is subsidy the most appropriate instrument to do it? When you answer these 2 basic questions, you can go to the design, and you have how you can improve the design of subsidies, how you can eliminate some distortions that the design of the subsidies generate, and you can improve this, make it more effective, and also if you can save some resources, is the way in which this design needs to be thinking. The third aspect is, okay, we need to calculate the fiscal cost and how will be the fiscal reduction that we will have if we reform the subsidy. Most important than the accounting of fiscal cost of subsidies is to see if the subsidy has additionality. And for additionality, we understand that if the subsidy improves the welfare of the population in general. And when we answer this question, we pass to the next thing is implementation issues. How you can improve the implementation, what are the challenges of implementation. And finally, the toolkit consists on how you will evaluate post-evaluation. So basically, I will start with the first question, no? With the that I already anticipated. That the idea is to see what was the policy objective for which this subsidy was created. And the question, if you want to reform, is this original rationale that you have for the creation of subsidy, is it still valid today? That is the question that you do when you want to reform. In several cases, you want to have a subsidy to do industrial policy, to industrialize the country, to support your exports for many reasons. But the question is, after 20 or 30 years of your subsidy, is this original rationale still valid today? And that is the question that we depart. In many cases, you have subsidies that are for a long period, but the basic rationale disappeared. The subsidy is not needed anymore. And this is what we call, we do the first question. The second question that is also very important is, okay, the subsidy helped to industrialize the country or to improve the productivity of the country. But there are other instruments that can do the same at a lower cost. So the idea is to see if the subsidy is the most appropriate instrument to do it. And again, the same question in terms of time. This is the instrument that you use it, this subsidy, the way in which the public sector transfer unrequited transfers to the private sector is still the instrument is still effective in doing what the policy objective was aiming to do it. So these are the basic questions when that we are suggesting to governments to adopt when they will analyze or try to identify the subsidies that can be reduced or allocated, etc. So that is the basic question, and but we believe that this is the starting point. The second thing is on on the design. Basically, sorry. And before going to the second point, basically we have two main valid rationales for subsidies. The first is address of market failures. There are several things, but the main objective of a subsidy is the correction of market failures. There are several subsidies that they don't do that they create, rather than address market failures, they increase the distortions in the economy. They alter cost, they alter the allocation of resources instead of addressing the market failures. And the second main rationale for subsidies are the reduction of poverty. When you have subsidies to improve the access of the poor to public goods, when you give them cash transfers to support their income, or when you reduce, for example, the access to, or you reduce prices of fossil fuel, of energy, to ensure that the poor can access, that the public good is affordable. You can do also for education, etc. So these are the main rationales for a subsidy: the correction of market failures, or the reduction of poverty, or improving of the income distribution in a country. The second step that we have in our tool is the discussion of the design of the subsidies. So by design, we try to understand who is the main beneficiary of the subsidy, but also we need to distinguish what are the final beneficiary of the subsidy and who receives the subsidy. This is very important to him, because in several cases the recipients are not the final beneficiaries, or the beneficiaries, they don't receive the transfer. It comes for, the benefit for them comes from other sources. So that is the question, and here is if this the way in which the subsidy is transferred is the most efficient or not, and that is a critical question, because several times you have the subsidies is designed to reduce poverty, but at the end the poor are not benefited from the subsidy. As I mentioned here, we need to separate beneficiaries and recipients, and distinguish that in some cases they are the same, but in most of the cases are different. In some cases you provide the subsidy to the firms, but the final beneficiary are the consumers of the goods. In other cases, the idea is to benefit the consumers, but the firms stay with all the subsidy. They don't transfer to the final beneficiaries, to the household or the consumer. So that is a very important design type. How you define and design your mechanisms in which you will transfer the resource also is very important to define the effectiveness of the subsidy instrument that you will analyze. In several cases, you have a strong rationale for having a subsidy. It's very clear that the subsidy is the most appropriate instrument to achieve this policy objective. But when you see the design and you see that the final beneficiaries, they don't receive the subsidy because the subsidy was appropriated by other segment of the population of the firm, that is the thing that makes the subsidy, even if it's with a strong rationale and it's appropriate, you at the end then you are ineffective because you are not achieving the final beneficiaries of the subsidy. The third step is when you have the definition, you need to estimate the fiscal cost, and for the fiscal cost, we understand two things. A subsidy has a direct fiscal cost, the cost of the program that you have. But at the same time, you need to estimate some savings that you can have with that. Imagine that you have a subsidy for education. So the direct cost is the subsidy that you are transferring to the families to put the kids in the school. But this, as the kids are in the school, they will be more productive over time. So they will generate more income and more taxes, and you need to account that when you estimate the fiscal cost. What we call the fiscal externalities over time. The idea that if you create the program, you need to also take into account that this program will generate not only cost, but also benefits that can be reverted to the public sector. So the idea is to calculate the net fiscal cost over time of the program. As I mentioned before, we have the two things. The direct cost of the transfer is very important also to consider administrative costs. There are subsidies that are well designed, they have the rational everything, but the cost, the administrative cost of the program is very high. And also to monitor, to do the targeting are very, very costly in certain cases. So you need to consider all the direct fiscal costs of the subsidy. And as I mentioned before, you have in several cases, you have benefits, but also you can increase the cost of the subsidies because you are generating contingent liabilities, risk, etc., that can add to the direct fiscal cost. So the idea is to measure in a way the direct fiscal cost, but also other costs that are embedded in the program but are not observed, and you need to calculate that. On additionality is exactly what I mentioned before. What is the overall impact of the subsidy in the economy? It increases, it's okay, it increases investment, created more jobs, etc. But at the same time, they generated distortion. So all these costs and benefits you need to consider in the additionality. At the end, what you want to assess is the net welfare gain that the subsidy causes, no? And that is the thing that most of the countries, they don't have a good evaluation of their subsidy instruments. Consider for here an example of a reduction of the VAT. In this case is happening in Argentina, and I will show what happened. They decided to reduce the VAT for basic goods, for basic consumption goods, from the normal rate, the standard rate that is 21% to 0. So all basic goods were exempted. As you see here, the reduction in prices that this reduction of the VAT to 0 caused was lower than the 21% because part of the benefit was appropriated by the firms that they didn't transfer to the final consumers. You see that the difference between these two curves is what the stores receive, and this is the benefit to the consumer that is lower. And when the government decided to reestablish the VAT to 21, the rate to 21%, the prices increases much more than the previous one. When if you see here before the measure, during the measure, and you see that the prices increases more than before, even if the rate is 21%, meaning that most of this subsidy was appropriated by firms and not by the intended beneficiaries that were the consumers on this period. They needed to pay a higher price here, and the benefit, the price that they paid was not too different. They didn't receive the 21% discount. They received only part of that. So meaning that in some cases, as I mentioned before, the intention of the subsidy is to benefit the population or the poor population that consumes basic goods. But at the end, depending on how the market works, firms can appropriate of that. If you have, for example, firms that are monopolic, you will have this. The subsidy will be appropriated by firms, and this is what we show in several cases in the study. Here is other type of additionality that we see in general of different programs: cash transfer programs, a pensioner subsidy, other type of transfers, and in-kind rice subsidy that in several countries in Africa. What we have here is the fiscal cost, the budget of the program in the columns. The contribution, the blue dot is the contribution of this program to the reduction of poverty. Here we have in the right hand side, we have the marginal contribution to poverty reduction of the program. And then we have the cost effectiveness of the program. That is how much each point of reduction of poverty costed in terms of the fiscal. No? That is basically divide the reduction in poverty of the program on the over the budget of this program. So we have for different programs, different. No, this the cash transfer program seems to be very effective, and also the in-kind seems to be very effective with the reduction in poverty is very high, is very pronunciated. But when we see the cost of the program, the logistic cost of a subsidy rice, the in-kind type of service, the figure is very different because there are a lot of as I mentioned, administrative cost of doing this type of in-kind subsidy, that the cost effectiveness of the program falls significantly. So this program, if you see the first graph without counting the logistic cost of the program, you see that the in-kind subsidy is as effective as a cash transfer program. But the cash transfer program has less logistic cost than the program. When you include this logistic cost to the program, you see that the cost effectiveness is not as big as in the first graph. Finally, we have the implementation phase, no? All the things, because in many cases, the details of implementation are as critical as the design, as the rationale, as the other aspect that we discussed. And to do, it's important to analyze the institutional capacity of the agencies that will implement the subsidy. And there are several things that you need to take into consideration is if the different agencies are coordinated or not. In several cases, you have subsidies that have contradictory objectives. For example, fossil fuel subsidies and green subsidies. The fossil fuel subsidies counteract all the positive effect of the green subsidies, and at the end, you don't know what is the net effect of the two subsidies. So, how the institutional arrangements are in place to make the implementation of the subsidy smooth, that is very important. No? Also, the use of technology, etc., how you improve the implementation of your program. And finally, is the evaluation. That is very important. And because if you don't have evaluation, if you don't have evidence, how you will reform the subsidy, how you will eliminate the subsidy, on why or why you decide to keep the subsidy instrument. And this is something that few countries have. How to evaluate ex post evaluation of subsidies is very, very, is not common in several countries. But the idea is if you are creating a new subsidy, it's important to plan how you will evaluate the subsidy. And that will be very important. These are the toolkits, and the final part of our presentation is more or less on how we evaluate the benefits and cost of subsidies. And we use the marginal value of public funds as the methodology to evaluate. I will go quickly because I think that we are over time, no? Yes. And basically, the idea is to evaluate, as I mentioned it before, the principles are, I will take only the principles. What are the benefits of each subsidy instrument? The address of market failures, the improvement in income distribution, the promotion of investment and employment, increase of productivity, and you have the cost here. No? The costs are several. And the idea is that basically what cost-benefit analysis is to weigh the two things and decide if the benefits are higher than the cost the program can go. But there are several criteria to do because it's more complicated, and we also propose a very very specific methodologies that we call the net social benefit criteria to see how subsidies needs to be evaluated. And I will not go, but basically what we are doing is a very simple exercise of cost benefit. You have the marginal value of the program, what is the marginal benefit that the program promotes, and compare this with the cost of this program. And basically, we will have that rationale. And this is what we have here. We estimate for the different, in the sectoral chapters, we do all these calculations to see what programs are more effective or more efficient than others, what programs have a higher marginal value of public funds. And also we need to consider the distortions that in terms of cost, the distortions of taxation, because to pay that for subsidies, to finance subsidies, you need to increase taxation, and you need to consider also the distortions that the higher taxation causes in the economy. So balancing the two things, the marginal value of public funds with the marginal cost of public funds, you can find criteria to say, okay, these subsidies have higher net social benefits, and these are the subsidies that can be preserved. Or on the contrary, if you have negative net social value, basically this is indicating you that you need to eliminate or reduce this subsidy, and that is what we have here. As I mentioned before, we know that all the technical aspects are clear. We can have methodologies to evaluate, but the question is, why subsidies? When you know that many subsidies are inefficient, you have evidence that are inefficient, that they are not achieving their objectives, why they are still in place. And basically what we consider is that there are political economy aspects that prevents the reform of subsidy. And for that also we offer some political economy tools to try to overcome the obstacles for reforms. And for that, basically what we do is to assess the political economic conditions of subsidy reform. And the questions are very clear, no? Who are the beneficiaries of this subsidy? Who pays this subsidy? And if everybody understands that the subsidy is problematic or not, etc., and have that. The second is that, and this is the experience that we have over the world, that okay, you will reform the subsidy, but somebody will be affected by that. If you want to have the subsidy, you need to compensate losses. For example, now after the the COVID and the Russia invasion to Ukraine, energy subsidies increased a lot. We know that, and the idea would be to reduce these subsidies. Also, it's very clear that the fossil fuel subsidies, energy subsidies, benefit the richest part of the population the most. So it's very clear that, but also the poor benefit from the subsidy, and you need to compensate them if you want to give the support. So the idea is how you create compensation mechanisms that will enable the population to be not too opposed to the reform of subsidies. And finally, that is important that you need to have very good communications. Communication is very critical because in several cases, countries with good intentions, government with good intentions, good rationale for reforming the subsidies, if they don't have a good narrative, it's difficult to eliminate these subsidies. So I will complete here my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.